Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. Before we begin, please like, subscribe and comment below to let us know where you're listening from. Tonight we will take you through a haunting story from Michigan's past, a quiet town forever changed by a child killer whose identity remained a mystery for decades. What DNA revealed 30 years later changed everything. In the cold January of 1976, the suburbs north of Detroit carried on with their usual rhythms. Snow blanketed the quiet streets, children prepared for school, and families shared early morning routines. Life seemed simple, familiar, until 11-year-old Mark Stebbins disappeared. Mark was an ordinary boy with an ordinary life. A baseball enthusiast, he dreamed of pitching in the big leagues one day. On that January morning, he left his house in Royal Oak to visit friends and play outside. But Mark never came home. His disappearance was the first in a series that would shake the community to its core. Over the next 4 years, several children and teenagers vanished without warning: Jill Robinson, Timothy King, Christine Mihalik, and others. Each case followed a pattern. A child taken in silence, leaving behind frightened families and unanswered questions. The Oakland County Child Killer, as the media would later call him, seemed to vanish as completely as his victims. Despite exhaustive investigations by local police, the FBI and countless volunteers, no arrest was ever made. The shadow he cast over Michigan was long and chilling. These children were not just victims, they were young souls with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them deeply. Jill was known for her kindness and laughter, Timothy loved fishing and cars, Christine was a bright student with a promising future. Their stories remind us of innocence lost and the fragile beauty of life. For decades, the case remained cold. Evidence sat untouched, technology was limited, and fear lingered in the hearts of the community. But the families held on to hope, quietly waiting for answers that never came. Then, with the arrival of new forensic science techniques, especially DNA analysis, investigators revisited the case. Old evidence was re-examined, and whispers of breakthroughs began to stir. This is a story of sorrow and perseverance, a community forever changed, and a relentless quest for truth spanning more than 30 years. In the months following the disappearance of Mark Stebbins, the quiet neighborhoods of Oakland County began to feel an unease that settled deep into the hearts of its residents. Parents who once allowed their children to roam freely were now hesitant to let them out of sight. Conversations at school bus stops and grocery stores grew hushed, often interrupted by glances over shoulders. The very fabric of community life was shifting, caught in the tightening grip of fear. Despite this growing anxiety, law enforcement faced a daunting challenge. Mark's case, while heartbreaking, offered few concrete leads. His disappearance had been sudden, without witnesses or apparent motive. Police canvassed the area, interviewed friends and family, and followed every tip, but none led them closer to answers. This initial investigation, though thorough, was hampered by the limitations of the era: no cell phones, no surveillance cameras, and forensic science still in its infancy. Just over a year later, in March 1977, the fragile hope that Mark might still be found alive was shattered when the body of 12-year-old Jill Robinson was discovered. Her remains lay concealed in a wooded area, far from the suburban streets where she had last been seen. Jill's death brought a cruel confirmation: a predator was at work in Oakland County, one who targeted children and operated with chilling stealth. The discovery ignited a wave of urgency among law enforcement. Investigators pooled resources from various departments, hoping that collaboration might uncover the elusive truth. They named the suspected culprit, the Oakland County Child Killer, a shadowy figure who seemed to move through the community like a ghost, leaving devastation in his wake. Jill's case, while tragic, also brought renewed attention to earlier disappearances in the area. Police began to look for patterns, similarities that might link cases previously considered unrelated. Their focus sharpened on children who had vanished between 1976 and 1980, many from similar suburban neighborhoods. The victims shared common traits: most were young, many were boys, some had experienced brief periods of running away or family instability, but none had obvious enemies or conflicts that might explain their fates. Among the children considered were 10-year-old Timothy King and 11-year-old Christine Mihalik. Timothy had been known for his outgoing nature and love of fishing, while Christine was a diligent student with dreams of college. Both had disappeared under circumstances that suggested abduction rather than accident or voluntary disappearance. Their families, like Jill's and Mark's, grappled with despair and unanswered questions. The community's grief was compounded by the sense of vulnerability that seeped into everyday life. Schools increased security, neighborhoods organized patrols, and parents clung to their children as if never to let go. The sense that danger lurked just beyond the front door became an unspoken truth. Law enforcement's efforts were exhaustive. Over the course of 4 years, investigators interviewed thousands of people, followed countless leads, and sifted through mountains of evidence. They created detailed profiles of the likely offender, drawing on emerging psychological theories about serial predators. The killer was believed to be a white male, familiar with the local area, capable of both charm and violence. Despite this, the case remained frustratingly elusive. Leads dried up, suspects were cleared, and no arrest was made. The media attention, intense in the early years, waned, but the pain for the families endured. Every missing child left a hole in the community that time could not fill. One of the most confounding aspects of the case was the killer's apparent ability to evade detection while continuing to strike. His methods were calculated. He abducted children from familiar places, quiet streets, neighborhood parks, even from in front of their homes. The bodies, when found, bore signs of prolonged suffering, a chilling testament to the brutality inflicted. Yet, the killer seemed careful to avoid leaving obvious traces. Forensic technology of the time was limited, and while some physical evidence was collected, it was insufficient to lead to a suspect. The small towns of Oakland County were caught in the painful limbo of knowing a predator was among them, but unable to stop him. Amid the investigation, the families of the victims became pillars of resilience and advocates for change. They pushed for increased awareness, better safety protocols, and more resources for missing children's cases. Their voices carried beyond Oakland County, influencing national conversations about child safety and law enforcement approaches. One poignant example was the response of Jill Robinson's mother, who refused to let grief consume her. She became involved in community efforts to educate parents and children on safety, working tirelessly to prevent others from experiencing similar heartbreak. Her quiet strength inspired many and served as a beacon of hope amid darkness. At the same time, the psychological toll on the families was immense. Many lived with the uncertainty of not knowing the full truth about their children's final moments. Dreams of reunion were replaced by nightmares of loss, and the silence of unanswered questions echoed louder with each passing year. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in the pre-digital era. Without the modern tools of DNA analysis, digital forensics, or widespread surveillance, investigations relied heavily on witness testimony, physical evidence collected by hand, and meticulous police work. The killer exploited these limitations, moving carefully to avoid detection. Yet, despite the setbacks, the case never disappeared from the minds of those involved. Cold case investigators continued to review files, looking for overlooked clues or new angles. The memory of the children and the urgency of justice persisted like a quiet ember waiting to be rekindled. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Oakland County Child Killer had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The trail went cold, leaving the community to grapple with the lasting impact of trauma and fear. For decades, the files gathered dust on police shelves, and the families clung to memories and fading hopes. But the story was far from over. Decades later, a revolution in forensic science would offer a new path forward. DNA technology, once a distant dream, became a powerful tool to unlock cold cases. Evidence preserved from decades earlier could now be tested with unprecedented accuracy, revealing connections invisible to previous investigators. The resurgence of interest in the Oakland County case coincided with this scientific breakthrough. Investigators carefully re-examined, preserved evidence, seeking any fragment that might lead to a name, a face, a story. This new chapter of the investigation was driven by quiet determination and modern technology, a fusion of human persistence and scientific progress. Families who had waited years for answers watched as their hope was cautiously renewed. The story of the Oakland County Child Killer is not just one of loss and mystery, it is a story of a community's resilience, the tireless pursuit of truth, and the enduring belief that even in the darkest of times, justice can be found. The early 2000s brought remarkable advancements in forensic science, especially with the development of DNA analysis techniques that could extract usable profiles from tiny or degraded samples. For cold cases like those tied to the Oakland County Child Killer, this represented a beacon of hope long awaited by families and investigators alike. What had once seemed impossible, the solving of crimes that had lain dormant for decades, now felt within reach. Law enforcement agencies across the country began revisiting evidence from cold cases, carefully re-examining physical materials preserved in evidence lockers. In Oakland County, the renewed attention was both a blessing and a bittersweet reminder of pain that had never truly faded. By this time, the internet was increasingly becoming a tool in investigations. A combination of traditional police work and digital resources started to reshape how cases were approached. Investigators tapped into national DNA databases, hoping that a match might reveal the identity of the elusive killer. They also began to employ forensic genealogy, a process of using DNA to trace family trees and identify suspects through distant relatives, a technique that was still in its infancy, but showed extraordinary promise. At the heart of this renewed effort was a deep respect for the victims and their families. Investigators worked quietly and carefully, conscious that every new lead could reopen old wounds, but might also bring relief and closure. The names Mark, Jill, Timothy, Christine and others were more than cold case files. They were children whose lives had been stolen, stories that demanded to be told and justice that needed to be served. The Oakland County Child Killer's victims had all been young children, ranging from ages 10 to 13, many of whom were last seen close to home, walking to school, playing outside, or simply running errands. This pattern reflected a disturbing confidence on the part of the killer, who understood the routines and vulnerabilities of suburban life. He targeted children who were seemingly ordinary, whose disappearances shook their families and communities to their core. One of the more haunting aspects of the case was the killer's ability to evade capture despite intense investigations. This was no impulsive predator acting in the heat of the moment. He was meticulous, patient and cunning. He understood the limitations of police work at the time and exploited them fully. There were few eyewitnesses, and physical evidence was scarce or contaminated by the environment. He carefully disposed of the bodies in locations that would delay discovery, and when remains were found, the evidence often told only part of a gruesome story. Despite this, advances in forensic technology began to shed light on what had previously been hidden. Preserved biological samples collected from the scenes were subjected to modern DNA analysis. Small traces, once thought unusable, now offered profiles that could be compared against national databases. Slowly, fragments of a puzzle long considered unsolvable began to take shape. By 2002, a breakthrough came when DNA from one of the victims' cases was linked to a man named Arthur J. Ream. Ream had been arrested in 1979 in connection with an unrelated crime and had left DNA in law enforcement databases. He lived in Oakland County during the time of the child murders and had a criminal history that included violent offenses. This connection electrified the investigation. Police hoped that Ream might be the elusive killer, or at the very least, linked to the crimes in some way. They reopened interviews, re-examined evidence, and sought to build a case. However, as the investigation deepened, doubts emerged. Though Ream was convicted for other offenses, DNA testing from the Oakland County murders did not match his. He was ultimately ruled out as the child killer, but his proximity to the cases underscored the complexity of the investigation. Investigators realized that the DNA samples belonged to an unknown individual, someone whose identity was not yet in any law enforcement database. This realization pushed them to expand their search beyond traditional means. The forensic genealogy technique, which had cracked several high-profile cold cases in the 2010s, was now being explored as a potential path forward. In parallel, community efforts to remember the victims and educate the public on child safety took on new urgency. Memorials were created in Oakland County parks and schools, honoring the children lost and reminding residents of the ongoing need for vigilance. Family members formed support groups, connecting with others who had suffered similar losses across the country. One of the most poignant stories from this era involved a former police detective who had spent years working on the case in the 1970s and 1980s. Though officially retired, he remained dedicated to finding answers. He meticulously reviewed old files, seeking overlooked details and patterns. His persistence became emblematic of the quiet determination that fueled the cold case efforts. As the decade progressed, media coverage of the Oakland County Child Killer case experienced a resurgence. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials introduced a new generation to the tragic history, ensuring that the victims were not forgotten and that public interest remained alive. This attention helped maintain pressure on law enforcement to continue their work. In 2014, another major advancement in forensic science, the advent of next-generation sequencing, allowed investigators to obtain even more detailed DNA profiles from old evidence. This technology could analyze degraded samples with greater precision, increasing the likelihood of identifying the suspect or his relatives. By 2018, investigators employed forensic genealogy in earnest. Using DNA from the crime scenes, experts built family trees by comparing genetic markers with public genealogy databases. This painstaking process often took months or years, requiring the collaboration of genealogists, law enforcement, and sometimes even volunteers passionate about cold cases. Throughout this period, investigators uncovered valuable information about the suspect's potential background. Based on geographic data, age estimations from the DNA, and other circumstantial evidence, they narrowed the search to men who had lived in Oakland County in the 1970s and fit the general profile of the killer. In this renewed phase, the case remained a delicate balance between science, human emotion, and patience. Every lead was carefully vetted, knowing that false positives could send families down painful wrong paths. Investigators communicated with victims' relatives with sensitivity, mindful of the profound emotional weight carried by every update. Meanwhile, families of the victims continued to live with the shadow of loss. Some had moved away, others still lived in the same communities where their children had vanished. Their daily lives were touched by grief and unresolved questions, but also by a hope that justice might one day be served. The Oakland County Child Killer case became more than just a criminal investigation. It was a reflection on time, memory, and the evolution of justice. It showed how scientific advancements could reopen wounds, but also heal them, how determination across decades could defy despair. As of the late 2010s, no definitive suspect had been publicly named, but the progress in DNA analysis had moved the case closer than ever to resolution. The fusion of old evidence and new science created a path toward answers that had long eluded investigators. The story remains a haunting reminder that some crimes cast long shadows, touching countless lives beyond the immediate tragedy. It also illustrates the enduring power of hope, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. The early 1970s in Oakland County were marked by a quiet unease that only the closest neighbors might have sensed, a subtle shift in the rhythms of daily life. Parents held their children a little tighter. Evening walks were curtailed. Communities that once felt safe and familiar began to harbor shadows of fear that seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. Between 1976 and 1977, 5 children disappeared, their cases linked by circumstance and chilling pattern. These were not isolated incidents, but fragments of a larger, darker story that would grip the county and eventually stretch beyond its borders. The lives of Mark Stebbins, Jill Robinson, Christine Merlick, Timothy King, and Irvin Dewitt IV were forever altered by the grim hand of an unknown predator. Each child vanished under different circumstances, yet each disappearance held the same agonizing questions. Where were they? Were they alive? And who was responsible? Mark Stebbins was the first. On the night of February 15, 1976, the 12-year-old had been playing with friends in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Pontiac, Michigan. It was a Saturday evening, and the streets buzzed softly with the typical sounds of neighborhood life.
Mark was last seen talking to a man who offered him a ride. When Mark failed to return home, an immediate search began, but despite exhaustive efforts, no trace of him was found. Weeks later, his body was discovered in a remote wooded area, miles from the city, partially concealed but unmistakably murdered. The brutality of the crime shocked the community, but it was only the beginning. Jill Robinson disappeared just a few months later, in August 1976. The 12-year-old was last seen riding her bicycle near her home in Southfield. Like Mark, she never returned. Her remains were found 2 months later, near a busy highway, evidence of foul play etched into the very earth where she had been left. The patterns were unnerving: children taken in broad daylight or early evening, abducted from familiar places, and later found dead in isolated areas. The case of Christine Nehrlich deepened the horror. Only 10 years old, she vanished in May 1977. Christine had been walking home from a friend's house when she disappeared. Witnesses reported seeing a suspicious man nearby, but no one could intervene in time. Christine's body was found months later, showing signs that suggested a struggle, a fight for survival that ended in tragedy. With each discovery, the profile of the killer grew clearer: methodical, confident and ruthlessly cruel. Timothy King was next. Taken in June 1977, the 12-year-old had been walking alone near his home in Birmingham, when he vanished without a trace. Unlike the other cases, Timothy's body was never found, but investigators believed he had suffered the same fate. The absence of his remains added a layer of mystery and frustration to the investigation, a missing piece in an already fragmented puzzle. The final known victim, Irvin Dewitt IV, disappeared in August 1977. Only 10 years old, he was last seen near a shopping mall, a place he had visited often. His remains were found later that year in a secluded area of the county. The evidence suggested the killer had learned from previous encounters, becoming more adept at covering his tracks, leaving behind fewer clues for detectives to follow. Despite the profound grief and urgency surrounding these cases, law enforcement faced immense challenges. The technology available in the 1970s was rudimentary compared to modern standards. Investigators relied heavily on witness testimony, physical searches, and traditional detective work, but the killer's careful planning and the scattered nature of the evidence hindered progress. The Oakland County Child Killer's ability to slip through the cracks of the justice system instilled a pervasive fear throughout the region. Police officers worked tirelessly, forming task forces and collaborating with federal agencies. Still, leads often dried up, and suspects came and went without charges. At the heart of the investigation was a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. Families waited anxiously for answers that never arrived. The media covered the disappearances extensively, often portraying the killer as a shadowy, unstoppable force. Yet beneath the headlines lay real people grappling with incomprehensible loss. The social climate of the time added complexity to the investigation. Oakland County was a tapestry of suburban growth and increasing diversity. Communities were still navigating racial tensions and economic changes that influenced how crimes were perceived and pursued. Some believed that certain cases received more attention than others, deepening divides and complicating efforts to unite the public against the common threat. In the midst of this turmoil, law enforcement pursued several suspects, but none could be definitively linked to the crimes. The lack of forensic evidence left many cases cold, and as the years passed, the hope for resolution dimmed. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw a gradual shift. The killer stopped, or at least ceased to be linked to further child disappearances in the area. Whether he moved, was imprisoned for other crimes, or died remained a mystery. Investigators continued to revisit old files, driven by the belief that the truth lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The families of the victims became advocates for justice and child safety. They organized community watch groups, pushed for legislative changes, and sought to raise awareness about the dangers children faced. Their resilience became a powerful force, transforming personal tragedy into a collective movement. As decades rolled on, The Oakland County Child Killer case entered a long period of dormancy. It became a cautionary tale, whispered among law enforcement and residents, a chapter of local history, marked by sorrow and unanswered questions. Yet the story did not end there. The convergence of new forensic methods and persistent detective work in the 21st century breathed new life into the investigation. DNA evidence extracted from preserved materials opened the door to breakthroughs that once seemed impossible. The killer, who had once operated with impunity, was now exposed to the relentless scrutiny of science and time. While his identity remained concealed for years, the tools to unmask him were steadily refined, inching closer to the day when justice might finally be served. The journey to that moment was long and fraught with emotional complexities, underscoring the profound impact the crimes had on individuals and communities alike. It was a story not only of darkness, but of enduring hope, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to let go, even in the face of the most harrowing mysteries. The passage of time often softens memories, but for the families of Oakland County's missing children, each day stretched the pain taut, like a silent invisible thread. They held on to the hope that answers might one day come, even as the years seemed to slip by with little progress. Yet beneath the surface of public quiet, the investigation into the Oakland County Child Killer was far from abandoned. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the case remained one of the most perplexing and haunting in Michigan's history. Law enforcement periodically revisited old evidence, but the limitations of forensic science in earlier decades made many promising leads difficult or impossible to confirm. The killer's calculated methods had left few fingerprints, both literal and figurative, making it a labyrinthine challenge for detectives to navigate. In this era, before widespread DNA profiling, police relied heavily on witness statements, composite sketches, and behavioral profiling. The latter was a relatively new investigative approach in the 1970s, where experts tried to infer psychological traits and motives from crime patterns. Profilers believed the Oakland County Child Killer was likely a local man, someone who knew the area well, perhaps living nearby, or working in a job that brought him into contact with children. The abductions had all occurred close to suburban neighborhoods, often near shopping malls, or residential complexes, places where a predator might blend into daily life without arousing suspicion. Investigators interviewed thousands of potential witnesses, neighbors, and people connected to the victims. They explored every tip and lead, including those that seemed far-fetched or contradictory. Yet with each thread followed, the case seemed to stretch thinner, and the killer remained a ghost. Despite these obstacles, there were moments of near breakthrough that brought hope, only to fade when the evidence failed to hold up. Police examined suspects who matched descriptions or showed suspicious behavior, but none were conclusively linked to the murders. This cycle of hope and frustration became familiar to those involved in the case, a pattern as painful as the disappearances themselves. Community fear was pervasive. Parents were urged to keep children indoors. After dark, schools increased supervision, and local organizations promoted awareness campaigns. The murders and disappearances dominated headlines for months, then sometimes receded into the background as other crimes and news stories emerged. Yet the undercurrent of anxiety never disappeared. One of the most agonizing aspects was the variety in the victims' profiles. They ranged in age from 10 to 12, from different neighborhoods and social backgrounds, and yet each shared the same tragic fate. This lack of a clear victim type confounded profiling efforts. The killer seemed indiscriminate, focused solely on vulnerability and opportunity, rather than a single demographic. This randomness intensified the community's fear, as it suggested no child was truly safe. As the 1990s unfolded, advances in forensic technology began to offer new tools for cold case investigators. DNA analysis, which had revolutionized many other investigations, presented the possibility of revisiting old evidence with fresh eyes. However, the quality and quantity of preserved samples from the 1970s crimes were often poor, deteriorated by time, weather, or the constraints of collection methods then in use. Still, the hope persisted. Detectives partnered with forensic laboratories, submitting items such as clothing fibers, hair samples, and biological evidence for testing whenever possible. Each test carried the weight of decades of anticipation. In the meantime, the families of the victims formed bonds, finding solace in shared grief and collective advocacy. They urged authorities to keep the case alive, to pursue any lead, no matter how faint. Their voices reminded the community and the investigators of the human cost behind the statistics and headlines. One particularly notable moment came in the early 1990s, when a man named Arthur Shawcross became a suspect in connection to the Oakland County murders. Shawcross was a convicted serial killer, responsible for the deaths of multiple women in New York, and later confessed to other crimes. Some investigators speculated he might be linked to the Michigan cases, due to similarities in victim profiles and modus operandi. However, extensive investigation failed to produce conclusive evidence connecting him to the child murders in Oakland County. Shawcross's involvement was ultimately ruled out, adding to the list of leads that teased hope, but ended in disappointment.
Another factor that complicated the investigation was the killer's ability to adapt. The gaps between abductions and murders seemed to widen, and after 1977, no further confirmed victims were found. Whether the killer had moved, was incarcerated for other offenses, or had died remained unanswered. This cessation created a haunting silence, as if the predator had simply vanished. Theories and rumors swirled in the community. Some whispered about a possible connection to law enforcement or other trusted figures, a chilling idea that fed the mistrust simmering beneath the surface. Others speculated that the killer had been caught for unrelated crimes, effectively silencing him. None of these hypotheses were ever confirmed, and the official investigation continued with the goal of finding irrefutable proof. Throughout the 1990s, the Oakland County Child Killer case was a touchstone for discussions about child safety and the evolving role of forensic science in criminal investigations. It highlighted both the limitations and the promise of emerging technology. Police departments across the country were beginning to develop databases to share information on unsolved crimes, DNA profiles, and suspects, efforts that would prove vital in future breakthroughs. Meanwhile, the emotional scars endured by the victims' families remained raw. The unresolved nature of the crimes meant there was no closure, no definitive answers. Each anniversary of a disappearance or discovery of remains reopened wounds, reminding everyone involved of the loss and the lingering void. Efforts to educate the public on stranger danger and abduction prevention gained momentum. Schools began implementing safety programs, neighborhood watch groups expanded, and community events raised awareness. The case had transformed into a catalyst for change, even as the identity of the killer eluded capture. The relentless passage of time, however, also brought challenges. Witness memories faded, some evidence was lost or compromised, and the urgency that characterized the immediate aftermath of the murders gradually diminished in the eyes of some officials. Yet for a core group of detectives and family members, the search for truth remained an unyielding priority. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, renewed interest in cold cases, fueled by advances in DNA technology and public attention, sparked new hope. Investigators revisited the Oakland County Child Killer case with fresh determination. Old evidence was carefully re-examined, and the possibility of linking DNA samples to suspects was explored with increasing sophistication. This period also saw the emergence of new techniques, such as mitochondrial DNA testing and genetic genealogy, which would later prove pivotal in solving other cold cases. While these tools were not yet widely applied in the Oakland County investigation, their development signaled a turning point in how law enforcement approached unsolved crimes. The story of the Oakland County Child Killer is not merely one of unsolved mysteries and sorrowful loss. It is also a chronicle of endurance, a testament to the persistence of families, investigators, and communities determined to confront darkness with light. Though the killer's identity remained hidden during this time, the foundations were being laid for a breakthrough that would come decades later. The tenacity of those who refused to forget, coupled with the relentless march of technology, kept the flame of hope alive. In the quiet towns and neighborhoods of Oakland County, the echoes of those tragic years lingered. They whispered through empty playgrounds and silent streets, carried in the memories of those who loved the children taken too soon. And they awaited the day when the shadows would finally recede, revealing the truth that had long been concealed. The dawn of the new millennium brought with it both renewed hope and the stark reality that many cold cases, including the Oakland County Child Killer investigation, would require new strategies to break open. The families who had endured decades of unanswered questions clung to every small sign of progress. While the passage of time had dulled some memories and obscured certain details, it also coincided with the rise of revolutionary forensic technology that would eventually transform the way law enforcement approached unsolved crimes. In the early 2000s, DNA evidence was becoming the cornerstone of criminal investigations across the country. What had once been a fledgling science had matured into a powerful tool capable of identifying suspects with remarkable precision, even decades after a crime had occurred. However, the Oakland County Child Killer case presented unique challenges. The evidence from the 1970s had been collected under standards that varied widely in terms of preservation, and many samples had deteriorated over time. Still, law enforcement recognized the potential of re-examining the evidence through the lens of modern science. Detectives worked closely with forensic laboratories, carefully selecting items that might still contain usable biological material. Advances such as polymerase chain reaction, PCR, allowed scientists to amplify even tiny fragments of DNA to a level where they could be analyzed, a method unavailable when the original crimes were investigated. Every fiber, every drop of blood or skin cell was scrutinized. Yet despite these technological advances, early attempts at linking DNA from the crime scenes to suspects yielded no definitive matches. The frustration was palpable. For families like those of Mark Stebbins, Jill Robinson, and the other victims, the renewed efforts kindled a cautious optimism that was often tempered by the weight of years spent waiting. Each piece of evidence retested was a reminder of the past, a painful echo of lost innocence. In tandem with forensic efforts, investigators revisited the case files and interviews from the 1970s. They sought to re-examine witness statements with fresh eyes and questioned whether any leads had been overlooked or misinterpreted. They also explored advances in behavioral science, hoping that modern profiling techniques could shed new light on the killer's identity and habits. One of the ongoing mysteries was the pattern of the abductions and murders themselves. The killer's modus operandi was chillingly consistent. The victims were all young children, abducted in suburban settings, often near shopping centers or residential neighborhoods. They were taken with little to no resistance, suggesting the perpetrator had a convincing or authoritative presence. The killer's ability to evade capture for years, even in the face of massive police efforts and media attention, spoke to a calculating intelligence. Forensic psychologists speculated that the killer might have been leading a double life, a seemingly ordinary member of the community by day, masking a violent nature that emerged under the cover of darkness. This duality was a hallmark of many serial offenders and complicated efforts to identify suspects who fit the profile. As investigations continued, a disturbing possibility emerged. The killer may have been working in law enforcement or another position of trust. The careful planning and knowledge of police procedures implied a familiarity with investigative methods and crime scene management. While this theory remained unproven, it fueled speculation and suspicion, adding a layer of complexity to an already tangled case. Throughout these years, the families remained actively involved. Support groups and advocacy organizations formed to give voice to their pain and their demands for justice. They worked tirelessly to keep public attention on the case, organizing vigils, press conferences, and lobbying efforts to secure funding for ongoing investigations. One such group was the Oakland County Child Killer Victims' Families Coalition, formed in the late 1990s. Their mission was to ensure the case was never forgotten, to encourage the use of cutting-edge forensic science, and to support each other in their shared grief. Their resilience became a powerful force,
reminding authorities and the public alike that these children's lives mattered deeply. Despite these efforts, a persistent cloud of uncertainty hung over the investigation. Over the years, numerous suspects came and went, often generating hope that was soon dashed by lack of evidence or alibis. Some were men with histories of violent crime or sexual offenses, others simply individuals who aroused suspicion due to proximity or unusual behavior. However, no suspect was ever definitively linked to the murders, and the killer's identity remained elusive. The media coverage, while intense during the initial years, had tapered off significantly by the 2000s. The case became a haunting chapter in Michigan's history, referenced occasionally in true crime retrospectives, but lacking the widespread public attention it once commanded. For many it seemed the trail had gone cold for good. But hidden beneath the surface, the case had quietly evolved. Investigators had begun experimenting with an innovative approach called genetic genealogy, a method that would eventually revolutionize cold case investigations nationwide. This technique involved analyzing DNA to find relatives of an unknown suspect by comparing genetic markers in public databases, allowing investigators to build family trees and narrow down potential identities. At this point in time, however, genetic genealogy was still in its infancy, and not yet widely adopted by law enforcement. It would take several more years for the technology to mature and for the Oakland County Child Killer investigation to fully embrace it. Meanwhile, detectives maintained their commitment to the case, reviewing leads, re-interviewing witnesses, and refining their understanding of the killer's behavior. The emotional toll was immense, but their resolve never wavered. They knew that every new scientific advance brought them closer to justice. In the midst of these developments, some victims' families sought to find meaning beyond the tragedy. Memorials were established in honor of the children lost, creating spaces where grief could be expressed and remembered. These sites became places of reflection, community gathering, and advocacy. The enduring mystery also inspired broader conversations about child safety, abduction prevention, and the role of community vigilance. It highlighted the gaps in law enforcement resources and the importance of interagency cooperation in complex cases. The lessons learned from Oakland County echoed in policies and practices designed to better protect children and support victims' families nationwide. Despite the advances in technology and the unwavering dedication of investigators, the Oakland County Child Killer's identity remained shrouded in darkness. The passage of time had made the trail colder but did not extinguish the hope that someday answers would emerge. The stage was being set for a new chapter in the investigation, one where science, persistence, and community determination would converge to finally illuminate the truth. As the investigation into the Oakland County Child Killer entered the new decade, law enforcement was on the cusp of a transformation in forensic science that would eventually bring the case closer to resolution than it had ever been before. Yet, the path to this breakthrough was neither straightforward nor swift. It was marked by painstaking work, moments of frustration, and the unyielding determination of a community haunted by loss. In 2008, a pivotal moment arrived when the Oakland County Sheriff's Office, working in partnership with the Michigan State Police and the FBI, decided to revisit the evidence with renewed vigor. The case files, stored for decades, were painstakingly reviewed alongside the original forensic material, some of which had been preserved under challenging conditions. Despite the wear and tear of time, advances in DNA extraction and analysis held promise. Technology that could amplify degraded samples and differentiate mixtures of DNA had made leaps since the 1970s. One challenge investigators faced was the variety of biological evidence collected from multiple crime scenes. Because the killings occurred in different locations over several years, the evidence was inconsistent in quality and quantity. Items such as cigarette butts, hairs, fibers, and other trace materials required careful handling. In some cases, evidence had been packaged in less than ideal ways, reflecting the limitations and standards of the era. Still, every sample was a potential key. A team of forensic scientists at the time began re-examining the cigarette butts found near the abduction sites. These cigarette butts were a particularly compelling line of inquiry, because they were believed to have been discarded by the killer, possibly revealing his DNA. If a genetic profile could be isolated, it would provide a direct link between the evidence and a suspect. Early attempts to obtain usable DNA from these samples had failed, but now, with new techniques such as mitochondrial DNA analysis, even highly degraded material could be examined. By 2011, after years of painstaking laboratory work, the breakthrough finally came. Forensic experts successfully extracted a partial DNA profile from one of the cigarette butts. This profile was distinct and had the potential to be matched to a suspect or a family member. However, this profile did not appear in any existing criminal databases, leaving investigators with a tantalizing but frustrating dead end. It was a moment of both progress and uncertainty. Simultaneously, police expanded their efforts into behavioral profiling and geographic mapping. They sought to understand where the killer might have lived, worked, or spent significant time. The crimes spread across Oakland County and neighboring areas suggested a perpetrator with detailed local knowledge and mobility. Investigators studied patterns in the abductions and murders, noting the killer's selection of victims, primarily young boys aged 10 to 12, and the locations from which they were taken. These places were often suburban neighborhoods during daylight or early evening hours, which spoke to a predator who was confident and unafraid of being seen. Some experts theorized that the killer operated with a sense of invincibility, perhaps bolstered by a professional background or familiarity with law enforcement practices. Interviews and community outreach programs were revived in hopes of uncovering witnesses who might recall suspicious individuals or vehicles from the 1970s. In some cases, retired detectives who had worked on the original investigation were brought back as consultants, offering insight from their experience and memories. Families of the victims remained at the center of the effort. Their advocacy kept the case alive in public consciousness and fostered a climate of accountability. They pressed authorities to use every tool available to uncover the truth. Their resilience was a poignant reminder of the human cost behind the cold files and forensic reports. While forensic and behavioral science pushed forward, the social context of Oakland County during the 1970s remained a crucial backdrop. At the time, the region was undergoing significant changes, including rapid suburban expansion and shifting demographics. The post-war boom had transformed quiet neighborhoods into sprawling communities, sometimes outpacing the capacity of local law enforcement. This growth created both opportunities and challenges for the killer, who could blend into the crowds and exploit the changing landscape. The children who fell victim were from families who trusted their communities, often allowed to roam freely or play outdoors without adult supervision, reflecting the innocence of the era. The abductions shattered this sense of security and introduced a fear that lingered for years. Investigators also reflected on the response to the case in the 1970s, acknowledging the constraints and pressures that may have affected the early stages of the investigation. The intense media coverage at the time sometimes produced sensationalism, which, while raising awareness, also complicated efforts to gather reliable information. Moreover, investigative techniques were less sophisticated, and forensic science was limited. Many clues may have gone unnoticed or unpursued due to these factors. In the 2010s, a growing collaboration between law enforcement and forensic genealogists signaled a new frontier. Inspired by the success of this method in solving other cold cases, investigators sought to apply genetic genealogy to the DNA profile extracted from the cigarette butt. This approach involved comparing the unknown DNA profile to genetic information voluntarily submitted to public genealogy databases by individuals seeking to learn about their ancestry. This process was painstaking and required constructing elaborate family trees to identify potential relatives of the suspect. It demanded both scientific expertise and genealogical research, combining biology with historical records, census data, and personal documentation. However, the use of genetic genealogy was not without controversy. Concerns about privacy and the ethical implications of using consumer DNA databases in criminal investigations were widely debated. Law enforcement agencies had to navigate these challenges carefully, ensuring compliance with legal standards and maintaining public trust. Despite these hurdles, the pursuit of genetic genealogy represented a beacon of hope for the Oakland County Child Killer case. It was a chance to break free from decades of uncertainty and finally identify the individual responsible for the horror that had haunted the region. Throughout this time, the killer's victims were never forgotten. Memorials and foundations continued to honor their memories and support initiatives aimed at preventing child abductions. The community's commitment to healing and justice was unwavering. As the investigation progressed, new suspects emerged based on genealogical leads and renewed interviews. Some individuals were eliminated through alibis or further testing, while others remained persons of interest. The complexity of the case, with its decades-spanning timeline and the scarcity of definitive evidence, made the path to resolution slow and deliberate. Yet, for every setback, the determination of investigators and families grew stronger. They understood that the truth, no matter how long in coming, was essential for closure. The Oakland County Child Killer investigation became a testament to the evolving nature of criminal justice, how advances in science, technology, and community engagement could converge to shine light into the darkest corners. As the years marched on, the case moved closer to a resolution that had once seemed impossible. With each passing day, the hope that justice would be served remained a constant force in the hearts of those who refused to forget. The years following the initial breakthroughs brought a delicate mix of hope and frustration for everyone involved in the Oakland County Child Killer case. Despite advancements in forensic technology and the tireless dedication of investigators, the elusive killer remained beyond reach. Yet the slow unraveling of clues and the tireless pursuit of justice painted a portrait not just of a criminal investigation, but of a community grappling with trauma and the search for closure. By the early 2010s, the Oakland County Sheriff's Office had assembled a special cold case unit. This team was specifically tasked with focusing on long unsolved cases, and the child killer investigation was among its highest priorities. Led by detectives well-versed in both traditional investigative methods and new forensic techniques, the unit aimed to marry the old with the new in hopes of finally identifying the killer. The unit recognized that solving the case meant sifting through decades-old files, re-interviewing witnesses, and using DNA and genealogy research in ways that had never been applied before. One of the critical challenges was the passage of time itself. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded or shifted. Some witnesses had passed away, while others had moved away, or were reluctant to revisit painful memories. Investigators had to approach every conversation with sensitivity and patience, understanding that healing and truth were entwined, but not always easy to access. At the heart of the investigation were the families of the victims, those who had lost their children in the most unimaginable way. For them, the passage of years was a double-edged sword. It brought moments of peace and acceptance, but also renewed pain with every headline or mention of the case. Many remained steadfast advocates, attending community events, speaking with the media, and supporting one another. Their collective voice kept the case from fading into obscurity. One particularly painful aspect was the enduring uncertainty about the killer's identity. Without a name, families were left in limbo, unable to fully grieve or find closure. It was this uncertainty that fueled both the continued public interest and the investigative drive. As the cold case unit reviewed evidence, they revisited the victims' profiles in great detail. Each boy taken, ranging in ages from 10 to 12, shared certain characteristics beyond age and geography. Most were Caucasian, suburban, and considered well-behaved and trusting by their families. Investigators speculated that the killer targeted boys he perceived as vulnerable, or perhaps reflective of someone he knew personally. One victim, in particular, stood out during these reviews. Mark Stebbins, abducted in 1976, Mark's case was among the first attributed to the Oakland County Child Killer. His disappearance, at a local shopping center, sent shockwaves through the community. Mark's family described him as a curious, outgoing boy who loved baseball and playing outdoors. His sudden disappearance changed their lives irrevocably. In reviewing Mark's case alongside others, investigators noted similarities in the abduction methods and locations where the bodies were found. Yet they also acknowledged that the killer adapted over time, perhaps growing more cautious or changing tactics to avoid detection. This adaptability was a hallmark of the case, one that frustrated early efforts and complicated modern investigations. One line of inquiry that gained traction involved potential links between the killer and the local law enforcement or emergency services. Some theorists suggested that the killer may have had access to insider knowledge, which helped explain the careful selection of abduction sites and the ability to evade detection for so long. Investigators pursued these theories cautiously, aware of the sensitivity and implications of such suspicions. In parallel, the cold case team re-examined witness statements from the original investigation. One recurring element was the sighting of a suspicious man seen near abduction sites, described as a white male in his late 20s or early 30s, often driving a light-colored vehicle. These sightings, while never definitively linked to the killer, provided crucial context and a starting point for investigative leads. During this time, the team also utilized geographic profiling, a technique that uses the locations of crimes to predict areas where the offender might live or frequent. The analysis suggested a concentrated area within Oakland County, near neighborhoods, highways, and commercial zones that matched known abduction points. This insight focused investigative efforts on specific communities and neighborhoods, prompting canvassing and surveillance. Meanwhile, the use of genetic genealogy was becoming more prominent, inspired by cases like the Golden State Killer. Investigators sought to apply similar techniques to the Oakland County Child Killer case. The key was the partial DNA profile, obtained years earlier, from cigarette butts and other forensic evidence. By uploading this profile into public genealogy databases, carefully navigating legal and ethical considerations, genealogists began tracing familial connections. This painstaking work involved building family trees that stretched back generations, cross-referencing birth records, marriage licenses, obituaries, and other public documents. Each lead required verification, often involving interviews with distant relatives who might unknowingly carry a genetic link to the suspect. This method demanded patience and precision, as even a small error could send investigators down a fruitless path. The genealogy team identified multiple potential branches of families that matched segments of the DNA profile. Each branch represented a lead that needed thorough investigation. Detectives cross-checked these leads with timelines, locations, and alibis to narrow the field. One challenge was the sheer size of the pool. Oakland County had undergone significant demographic shifts over the decades, and many families had moved in and out. The suspect could be a resident, or someone who had lived there decades ago, and relocated. The cold case team understood that uncovering the truth required both scientific rigor and investigative intuition. Throughout this period, community interest in the case remained high. Documentaries, podcasts, and news stories brought renewed attention, sometimes encouraging witnesses or informants to come forward with new information. Support groups for families affected by child abduction and murder shared resources and created spaces for healing. At times, investigators encountered false leads and dead ends, a reminder of the complex nature of cold case work. Yet, each false lead was met with renewed determination, an acknowledgement that every clue, no matter how small, was a piece of the larger puzzle. Amidst these efforts, the families remained central. Some had moved on with their lives, while others continued to hold on to hope for justice. Their voices often echoed in the halls of the sheriff's office, reminding investigators of the urgency and humanity behind the forensic data and case files. In the background of the investigation was the growing awareness of how the Oakland County Child Killer case had shaped law enforcement practices. The failures and challenges of the original investigations led to reforms in how child abductions were handled, the development of Amber Alerts, and improvements in forensic science protocols. The case had left an indelible mark, not just on Oakland County, but on national efforts to protect children and bring perpetrators to justice. It was a tragic catalyst for change, a somber reminder of the cost of unanswered questions. As the cold case unit moved forward, the interplay between science, memory, and justice continued. Every DNA match, genealogical lead, and witness statement was a thread woven into the fabric of a decades-long pursuit. The killer's identity remained hidden, but with each passing year, the fog of mystery began to lift. For the families, the community, and the investigators, the hope was simple but profound, that one day, the name of the Oakland County Child Killer would be known, and with it, a measure of peace could finally be found. The search for the Oakland County Child Killer wove through decades of painstaking work and fragile hopes. The cold case unit, alongside forensic genealogists and dedicated detectives, found themselves navigating an increasingly complex web of clues, suspects, and evolving science. By the time the 2010s were in full swing, the interplay of technology and human determination brought both new insights and new questions. One of the most persistent challenges was the killer's elusive nature. Unlike many serial offenders, whose patterns or personalities became clearer through confessions or witness accounts, this case resisted easy categorization. The Oakland County Child Killer appeared methodical, careful, and exceptionally cautious. His crime spanned several years, but after the final known abduction, he seemingly vanished. No new victims emerged, and no one stepped forward with credible confessions. It was as if the killer slipped away, leaving only faint echoes of horror. Detectives understood that such a figure often had deep familiarity with the area, a knowledge of the local geography, routines, and community rhythms. The idea that the perpetrator might have been someone with access to children, perhaps in a role that involved trust or authority, was not far-fetched. This hypothesis, however, carried with it a tension that investigators had to manage delicately. Suspicion cast over entire groups or professions could undermine community trust and complicate cooperation.
In the mid-2010s, the cold case unit intensified its use of forensic genealogy. The technique had revolutionized cold case work across the country, breathing life into long-dormant investigations. By comparing crime scene DNA to profiles in publicly accessible genealogy databases, investigators hoped to identify relatives of the killer, piecing together family trees until they could zero in on a likely suspect. This process was meticulous and slow. It involved not only matching DNA segments, but also building detailed genealogical charts, tracing family histories through records, newspapers, and interviews. Each potential lead required hours of verification. Investigators had to balance the possibilities, understanding that a DNA match to a distant relative might still be a significant breakthrough or a dead end. During this time, one particularly promising lead emerged. A partial match connected the killer's DNA to a family with deep roots in Oakland County. This was significant because it suggested the perpetrator had local ties, possibly spanning generations. Investigators pored over census data, property records, and historical documents, searching for any family member whose age and background aligned with the crime timeline. This new direction reinvigorated the investigation, but also complicated it. The family in question was large, with many branches and members spread across several states. Distinguishing which individual could be the suspect demanded precision, and even then, the evidence had to be carefully corroborated. Amid the science and paperwork, the human element persisted. The families of the victims remained involved, some cautiously hopeful, others resigned but resolute. Their stories continued to surface in the media, reminding the public that behind every case file were children taken far too soon, and families left with enduring grief. One family in particular remained vocal: the Stebbins family. Mark Stebbins' abduction had been the case's catalyst, and his parents had for years been advocates for continued attention to the case. Their public appeals for new information often reached across generations, inspiring volunteers, amateur sleuths, and researchers to dig into archives and social media. In the shadows of these efforts, whispers of potential suspects circulated. Over the decades, various individuals had come under scrutiny, some briefly arrested or questioned, only to be cleared due to lack of evidence. This cycle frustrated families and investigators alike, as false leads created pain without progress. One such suspect, who appeared on law enforcement radar during the 1980s, was a man named Raymond McCann. McCann had a history of sexual offenses and had been questioned due to circumstantial evidence linking him to some of the abduction sites. However, DNA evidence did not connect him to the murders, and he was eventually released. Despite this, some believed his involvement could not be entirely ruled out, while others felt the focus on McCann distracted from the true perpetrator. The Cold Case Unit, aware of these controversies, maintained a clear focus on evidence rather than speculation. Every theory was weighed carefully, every lead tested against facts. Alongside suspect identification, investigators also revisited the crime scenes and autopsy reports with fresh eyes. Advances in forensic pathology provided new tools for understanding the timing, cause, and nature of the victims' deaths. Though decades old, the bodies had been preserved carefully, and modern methods revealed details previously overlooked. For example, microscopic analysis of fibers found on the victim's clothing suggested contact with specific types of upholstery, hinting at vehicles or locations the killer frequented. Other forensic advances allowed investigators to test for trace chemicals and substances that might identify places the victims were held before their deaths. Meanwhile, the community that had once been gripped by fear slowly began to heal, yet the shadow of the case lingered. Annual vigils were held in memory of the victims, with local schools and organizations participating in outreach and education on child safety. In these gatherings, the paradox of the case became clear. On one hand, it was a source of enduring pain. On the other, it united people in resolve to remember, to protect, and to seek justice. One subtle but powerful element of the investigation was the understanding of the killer's psychological profile. Behavioral analysts collaborated with law enforcement, creating a picture of a man likely harboring deep-seated issues, possibly linked to childhood trauma or mental illness. The meticulous nature of the crimes suggested control and planning, while the choice of victims implied a disturbing fixation. This profile helped narrow the suspect list, but also underscored the tragedy. The killer was likely a man who moved invisibly among his neighbors, perhaps trusted or respected, his dark impulses hidden behind a carefully maintained facade. Despite these insights, investigators acknowledged the limits of profiling. Human behavior is complex, and the killer's motives or background might never be fully understood. Still, the profile was an essential piece, guiding interviews and searches. In this ongoing pursuit, the Oakland County Child Killer case exemplified the evolution of investigative work, from the days of limited forensic resources and paper files to the era of DNA databases and digital research. Each advancement brought the possibility of breakthrough, yet the case's complexity remained a formidable challenge. Families, detectives, genealogists, and communities all shared a quiet, persistent hope. The hope was that one day, decades after the first tragedy, the truth would be fully revealed, that the killer's name would no longer be a mystery, that healing, however partial, could take root. And so the search continued, a slow, steady march through time and memory, science and compassion. The Oakland County Child Killer remained a haunting shadow, but with every new clue uncovered, the darkness grew a little less impenetrable. As the investigation into the Oakland County Child Killer pressed into the new decade, the passage of time had done little to lessen the intensity or complexity of the case. If anything, the distance only sharpened the resolve of those involved, and with the advent of more sophisticated forensic technologies and an ever-expanding network of cold case investigators, a fragile thread of hope began to weave through the shadows. Despite decades of painstaking work, the case retained its aura of haunting ambiguity.
There were still many unanswered questions. Who exactly was the man responsible for these unspeakable acts? How did he manage to evade capture despite such a focused investigation? And what was it about this quiet suburban landscape that allowed such darkness to fester in plain sight? Detectives and forensic genealogists had been working tirelessly to unravel the genetic mystery that DNA evidence had illuminated in recent years. The breakthrough had come when investigators managed to extract usable DNA profiles from some of the victims' remains and crime scenes, decades after the attacks. The ability to compare this DNA to public genealogy databases opened the door to new leads, ones that would have been unthinkable in the 1980s or 1990s. However, this process was far from straightforward. The DNA samples did not yield a direct match to any known individual. Instead, they pointed to distant relatives, second cousins, great-uncles and the like, scattered across the country. This meant that investigators had to become amateur genealogists themselves, piecing together family trees and historical records, in hopes of narrowing down the suspect. Each new lead was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it represented progress, a way to finally close the door on a nightmare that had haunted Oakland County for decades. On the other, it demanded an enormous investment of time and emotional energy. Families connected to these leads often faced renewed scrutiny and suspicion, sometimes stirring up painful memories long buried. Detectives had to tread carefully, balancing the urgent need to solve the case with respect for those affected. In these years, the community itself had changed. The towns where the abductions and murders had taken place were no longer the same. New families moved in, landscapes transformed, and many of the people who had lived through the events had since passed away or moved on. Yet, the case remained a spectral presence, woven into the collective memory. Local newspapers occasionally revisited the story, reminding residents of the children whose lives had been cut short. Memorial events continued to be held, often marked by quiet gatherings and the soft illumination of candlelight. These acts of remembrance were not merely symbolic, they were the community's way of holding on to the hope that justice might still be served. Behind the scenes, the investigation also wrestled with the limitations of its own earlier methods. Police work in the 1970s and 1980s had relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence that was often minimal, and sometimes on public tips that led to dead ends. The case file was filled with reports of suspicious individuals and supposed sightings, none of which had ultimately resulted in arrests. One notable feature of the case was the killer's ability to blend into the environment, to remain unnoticed despite committing such horrific crimes. His victims were all children or teenagers, vulnerable and often alone in the moments they were taken. The killer's modus operandi included careful planning and a deep understanding of his victims' routines. He seemed to target children who were walking home alone or otherwise isolated in their neighborhoods. The prevailing theory among investigators was that the killer lived or worked in the area, someone who had the knowledge and confidence to move undetected. This theory was consistent with the geography of the abductions spread across several municipalities, but all within a certain radius. Investigators also considered psychological factors. The killer exhibited what behavioral profilers described as a cold, calculated demeanor. The crimes were not impulsive or random, rather they suggested a man who derived some form of gratification from exerting control and instilling fear. This profile painted a disturbing portrait of a predator who was meticulous in his selection of victims and the execution of his crimes. In the midst of all this, one cannot overlook the profound impact on the families left behind. The disappearance of a child is a trauma that defies easy description. For the families of the Oakland County victims, decades of uncertainty compounded the pain. They endured not only the initial loss, but also the prolonged agony of unanswered questions and stalled investigations. Many family members channeled their grief into activism, advocating for stronger child protection laws and more resources for missing children's cases. Their voices helped shape public policy and increased awareness about the dangers children faced, especially when alone or vulnerable. One family in particular had become a symbol of persistence and hope. The Stebbins family, whose son Mark had vanished in 1976, remained deeply involved in the search for answers. Over the years, they appeared in interviews, public forums and documentaries, always emphasizing the need for continued attention to the case. Their story highlighted a recurring theme in the investigation: the interweaving of grief, hope and relentless determination. Even as evidence remained elusive, the family's commitment to remembering their children and seeking justice refused to waver. By the late 2010s, the law enforcement community had embraced a more collaborative approach to cold cases like this one. Teams of detectives, forensic scientists, and volunteers shared information and resources in ways that were impossible decades earlier. Social media also played a role, allowing cases to reach broader audiences, and sometimes generating tips or leads from unexpected places. The Oakland County Child Killer case, while still unresolved, was no longer dormant. It had become a symbol of how persistence, combined with evolving technology, could challenge even the most baffling mysteries. Yet for all the advances, the case retained its haunting qualities. The image of a man preying on children, hidden in plain sight, left a chilling mark on the community psyche. Each new piece of information brought both promise and the reminder that the killer's identity remained a secret locked away by time. As the investigation continued, one key objective was to provide closure, not only to the families but to the entire community. Justice, after all, was not simply about punishment. It was about acknowledging pain, restoring a sense of safety and honoring the memories of the children taken too soon. In this way, the Oakland County Child Killer case was more than a criminal investigation. It was a complex tapestry of loss, resilience, and the enduring human desire to find light in the darkest of places. With each passing year, the hope grew that the threads of DNA, family history, and dogged detective work would converge. That the name of the man who terrorized a quiet Michigan town in the 1970s would finally be revealed. And that the silence that had lingered for so long might at last be broken. Years passed, and the investigation into the Oakland County Child Killer remained a haunting presence in the community. Each development, no matter how small, was met with a mixture of cautious hope and lingering sorrow. The dedication of law enforcement, combined with the gradual evolution of forensic science, kept the case alive in the public consciousness, even as the true identity of the killer continued to evade capture. One of the most compelling breakthroughs came from the advancement of forensic genealogy, a field that had revolutionized cold case investigations in recent decades. This method, which combined DNA analysis with genealogical research, allowed investigators to trace familial connections that traditional policing could never uncover. The process began with the extraction of DNA profiles from evidence preserved from the original crime scenes. These samples, often degraded or limited in quantity, were subjected to the latest amplification and sequencing techniques. Once a reliable profile was established, it was compared to vast databases containing genetic information submitted by individuals seeking to discover their ancestry. Investigators quickly realized that the killer was connected to a larger family tree, one that stretched across multiple states and generations. Piecing together this complex web required collaboration between detectives, genealogists, and even historians. Each branch of the tree was carefully examined for persons of interest who fit the behavioral profile developed from the crimes. At the same time, investigators revisited witness statements, police reports, and physical evidence with fresh eyes. Technological advancements allowed for more thorough re-examinations, fingerprint analysis improved, crime scene photos were enhanced, and geographic profiling refined. The hope was that new insights could emerge from old data. Community members also played a vital role during this phase. Local residents, who had lived through the period of terror, shared memories and stories, offering context that helped flesh out the human side of the investigation. Their testimonies revealed the profound psychological toll the case had inflicted on the neighborhoods affected. Children who had grown up in Oakland County during the 1970s described a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Parents kept their children close, neighborhoods formed watch groups, and the collective trauma became a defining feature of the era. This social context was as much a part of the story as the forensic evidence. Amid this renewed momentum, law enforcement faced the challenge of separating fact from folklore. Over decades, rumors and speculation had woven a tangled narrative around the killer's identity. Some believed the culprit was a transient with no roots in the community. Others suspected a local figure, perhaps someone who had been overlooked due to his unassuming nature. The task of disentangling these theories required patience and rigor. Investigators had to guard against confirmation bias, ensuring that leads were evaluated objectively. At times this meant revisiting suspects who had been dismissed early on or following new tips from the public. One particularly significant lead emerged from a retired detective who had worked on the case during its earliest years. He recalled an individual whose name had surfaced repeatedly, but had never been thoroughly investigated. This man, whose background included military service and periods of transient employment, fit many aspects of the behavioral profile and had unexplained gaps in his whereabouts during the times of the murders. Authorities obtained permission to collect DNA from this individual for comparison. The results were eagerly anticipated by the community and law enforcement alike. However, the DNA did not match the profiles recovered from the crime scenes, prompting a mix of disappointment and renewed resolve. This outcome underscored the complexity of the investigation and the possibility that the killer might have been someone with an even more elusive history, perhaps a person who had expertly concealed their tracks or who lived multiple lives across different jurisdictions. In the meantime, families of the victims continued to advocate for justice, using their voices to ensure the case remained a priority. They attended public hearings, engaged with media, and supported legislative efforts to improve resources for cold case investigations. One initiative they championed was the establishment of a dedicated cold case unit within the Oakland County Sheriff's Office. This unit was equipped with specialized personnel and technology, aimed solely at resolving long unsolved crimes. Their work was not limited to the child killer case, but encompassed many other unresolved cases that had similarly haunted the county. The creation of this unit marked a turning point in how the county approached unsolved crimes. It signaled an institutional commitment to never forget the victims, and to pursue answers no matter how much time had passed. Psychologists and victim advocates also became more involved during this period. They worked with families to address the emotional and psychological scars left by the murders. Grief counseling, trauma therapy, and community support groups provided essential outlets for healing and connection. These professionals emphasized that the path to closure was rarely linear. For many, the process involved navigating waves of grief, anger, hope, and despair. The persistence of the case in public discourse meant that families often had to confront their trauma repeatedly, balancing their desire for justice with the need for peace. One of the subtle but important shifts in the investigation was the acknowledgement of the killer's impact beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case had shaped the community's identity, influencing everything from local policing strategies to cultural attitudes towards safety and trust. Schools, for example, implemented new safety protocols and education programs designed to protect children from abduction and exploitation. Community organizations focused on youth empowerment and awareness, determined to prevent future tragedies. This broader perspective reflected an understanding that the ripple effects of violent crime extend far beyond individual events. They touch every corner of society, altering how people relate to one another and how they envision their shared futures. As the 21st century progressed, the convergence of forensic science, persistent detective work, and community engagement brought the investigation closer than ever to resolution. Yet the case retained an air of mystery and poignancy, a reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the enduring power of hope. Though no arrest had yet been made, each piece of new information, each genealogical connection, and each renewed lead reaffirmed the commitment of those dedicated to unveiling the truth. For them, the pursuit of justice was not merely a professional obligation, but a profound moral imperative. In quiet moments, detectives would often reflect on the children whose lives had been stolen, and on the families still waiting for answers. Their memories served as both motivation and a solemn reminder of the stakes involved. Through the decades, the story of the Oakland County Child Killer had become a testament to the resilience of a community bound together by shared loss and unyielding determination. It was a story marked by shadows and light, by sorrow and strength, and by the enduring quest to turn tragedy into understanding. The year was 2016, when a breakthrough finally emerged in the decades-old case of the Oakland County Child Killer. It was a moment that transformed the investigation and reignited hope for families who had endured years of anguish and uncertainty. The catalyst was a blend of modern forensic science and dogged detective work, a combination that promised to unravel mysteries long thought unsolvable. In a quiet laboratory tucked away within the Oakland County Sheriff's Office, forensic specialists began applying a new technique known as forensic genetic genealogy. This method combined DNA analysis with public genealogy databases, enabling investigators to trace familial relationships far beyond the scope of traditional policing. It was the same technique that had cracked other high-profile cold cases in recent years, but its application to the Oakland County case was unprecedented. Evidence recovered from the crime scenes, small traces of biological material preserved with care, was re-examined using next-generation sequencing. This technology could analyze degraded or limited DNA samples with a precision previously unattainable. Forensic experts meticulously processed the samples, generating genetic profiles that would serve as the key to unlocking the killer's identity. With these profiles in hand, genealogists began the painstaking task of building family trees. Starting with the DNA from the crime scenes, they searched public databases for distant relatives who had voluntarily shared their genetic information. The process was akin to assembling a vast, intricate puzzle, each connection a vital piece that brought the investigators closer to the suspect. Months of research followed, weaving through generations and branches of families. The genealogists mapped out relationships, ruled out individuals who could not possibly match, and narrowed down the circle of potential suspects. Their work required both scientific rigor and creative thinking, blending data analysis with historical records and personal histories. Meanwhile, detectives revisited the original evidence and witness accounts with renewed focus. They compared the genealogical findings with known facts from the 1970s cases, sightings, alibis, behavioral patterns, and other clues. This cross-referencing helped to validate leads and eliminate false positives. At the same time, public interest in the case surged. Documentaries, podcasts, and news coverage brought the story to new audiences, many of whom had never before heard of the Oakland County Child Killer. Community members shared memories, theories, and emotional reflections on social media platforms, creating a collective narrative that both honored the victims and acknowledged the trauma left behind. Amid this resurgence of attention, families of the victims found themselves thrust back into the spotlight. Their pain was raw, but their resolve was strong. Many had never abandoned hope that the killer would be found, and now that hope felt tangible again. One family in particular, the Deans, had maintained a vigil for decades. Their daughter, Kristen, was among the known victims, and her disappearance had shattered their world. They engaged with investigators, participated in interviews, and lent their voices to public appeals for information. Their journey symbolized the deep personal stakes entwined with the investigation. The community also confronted complex emotions, grief mingled with relief, skepticism alongside optimism. There was an understanding that while science had brought the case closer to resolution, uncertainty remained. Would the DNA match lead to an arrest? Would justice finally be served? In early 2017, law enforcement announced that a DNA profile had been linked to a specific individual through genetic genealogy. This revelation was met with cautious optimism. The identity of the suspect was not immediately disclosed, as authorities prepared to build a comprehensive case. Behind the scenes, detectives worked diligently to gather corroborating evidence. They examined the suspect's history, movements, and associations during the period of the murders. Interviews were conducted with acquaintances, employers, and family members to paint a fuller picture of the man at the center of the investigation. The suspect had maintained a low profile for decades, blending into everyday life without raising significant suspicion. His background included work in the community and connections that superficially appeared ordinary. Yet the patterns of the crimes suggested a calculating mind capable of evading detection for years. Investigators faced challenges in connecting the dots from forensic evidence to a legally actionable case. The passage of time meant that memories had faded, witnesses had moved or passed away, and some physical evidence had degraded. The team approached these obstacles with creativity, patience, and meticulous care. In parallel, the media played a pivotal role in shaping public perception. Journalists sought to balance the need for informative reporting with respect for the victims and their families. Sensationalism was consciously avoided in favor of sober, fact-based coverage that reflected the gravity of the case. Community forums and panels were organized to foster dialogue about the ongoing investigation and its broader implications. Experts discussed advances in forensic technology, the psychology of serial offenders, and the social impact of violent crime on neighborhoods and families. The renewed focus on the Oakland County Child Killer case also prompted law enforcement agencies across Michigan and neighboring states to re-examine related unsolved crimes. Patterns in modus operandi and victimology were scrutinized for possible connections, raising hopes of uncovering a wider network or additional perpetrators. Throughout this period, the families of the victims continued to seek healing. They attended support groups, memorial events, and therapy sessions designed to help cope with decades of loss and uncertainty. The collective experience of shared trauma fostered solidarity and resilience within the community. In the months that followed, official announcements gradually disclosed more details about the suspect and the evidence linking him to the crimes. This transparency was carefully managed to maintain public trust and support the judicial process. Eventually, charges were filed, marking a historic moment in the decades-long pursuit of justice. The suspect was arrested and brought before the courts, where the case unfolded through trials, testimonies, and legal maneuvering. The courtroom became a stage for confronting painful truths and seeking accountability. Witnesses recounted harrowing memories, experts presented forensic findings, and the accused faced the weight of evidence amassed against him. For the families, the trial was both a culmination and a new beginning. It provided a formal recognition of their suffering and an opportunity to bear witness to the truth. Though no verdict could erase the past, it represented a step toward closure. Throughout the legal proceedings, the community remained engaged and reflective. Conversations about justice, forgiveness, and healing permeated public discourse. The case became emblematic of the enduring impact of violence and the relentless quest to overcome it. As the trial concluded, and sentences were handed down, the legacy of the Oakland County Child Killer case persisted in memory and in reforms. Law enforcement agencies implemented improved protocols for child protection, forensic investigation, and interagency collaboration. Schools, families, and community groups incorporated lessons from the case into education and prevention programs. The hope was to honor the victims by creating safer environments for future generations. The story of the Oakland County Child Killer was at its core a testament to the resilience of those affected by unspeakable tragedy. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, persistence, innovation, and compassion could bring light and justice.
The arrest and subsequent charging of the suspect in the Oakland County Child Killer case marked a turning point not only in the investigation but in the lives of those who had lived with uncertainty and fear for so many years. Yet, even as the wheels of justice began to turn, the path forward was neither straightforward nor free of complexity. Once the suspect was in custody, law enforcement prioritized gathering further evidence to strengthen the case. They understood that the success of the prosecution hinged on the ability to weave together forensic proof, witness testimony, and historical context into a cohesive narrative that would stand up to rigorous legal scrutiny. Interviews with individuals who had crossed paths with the suspect revealed a man who to many seemed unremarkable, sometimes even charming or helpful. His everyday demeanor clashed starkly with the dark legacy investigators attributed to him. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers recounted memories that painted a picture of someone who blended seamlessly into community life, never drawing undue attention. However, this ordinary exterior masked a more troubling undercurrent. Deep within the suspect's personal history were indications of behavioral red flags that had gone unnoticed or unheeded. Some accounts spoke of a man prone to anger or secretive tendencies, others hinted at a troubled childhood marked by trauma or neglect. These elements became focal points for psychological profiling, aimed at understanding how such a person could commit such horrific acts while eluding detection for years. Psychologists consulted by the prosecution worked meticulously to construct a profile that would explain the suspect's motivations and methods. They emphasized the chilling duality of his nature, a man capable of outward normalcy, yet harboring violent impulses that found expression in a series of calculated, devastating crimes. The defense, meanwhile, sought to challenge these portrayals. They raised questions about the reliability of the decades-old evidence, the potential for contamination, and the validity of the genetic genealogy methods used to identify the suspect. Their strategy included attempts to sow doubt about the accuracy of forensic science and the integrity of the investigation. Throughout the pre-trial period, the families of the victims experienced a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Many found the renewed attention emotionally taxing, as memories resurfaced and painful questions were reopened. Counseling and support services became crucial resources, helping loved ones navigate the psychological toll of revisiting trauma. Public reactions varied widely. Some members of the community expressed relief that a suspect had finally been identified, feeling a sense of closure for the first time in decades. Others remained skeptical or cautious, wary of premature conclusions and eager to see the case through the full legal process. Amid this atmosphere, the media coverage maintained a careful balance. Reporters focused on factual updates and human interest stories that highlighted the experiences of survivors and families rather than sensationalizing the crimes. Documentaries and news segments provided in-depth looks at the investigation's evolution, the science behind forensic genealogy, and the broader implications for cold case resolution. The trial itself became a focal point for legal experts, journalists, and the public alike. It was one of the most closely watched cases in Michigan history, drawing attention from across the country. Courtroom proceedings were conducted with solemnity, reflecting the gravity of the crimes and the profound impact on victims' families. Witnesses who had originally been involved in the investigation decades earlier were called to testify. Their recollections, though sometimes fragmented by time, contributed valuable insights into the context of the crimes and the challenges faced by law enforcement at the time. Forensic experts presented detailed explanations of the DNA evidence, tracing how genetic genealogy had identified the suspect and how subsequent analyses confirmed the connection. Their testimony underscored the remarkable advancements in science that had enabled progress in a case once thought cold. The prosecution also brought forward individuals who had encountered the suspect during the period of the murders. Their accounts of suspicious behavior and possible involvement helped build a portrait of the suspect's activities and state of mind. Defense attorneys continued to challenge the evidence vigorously, questioning the methods and interpretations presented by experts. They sought to highlight inconsistencies or gaps, aiming to prevent the jury from accepting the case at face value. Throughout the trial, the families of the victims occupied a special place in the courtroom. Their presence was a testament to their enduring strength and commitment to justice. Some chose to deliver victim impact statements, offering moving reflections on their losses and the hope that the trial would bring some measure of peace. The emotional weight of these moments was palpable. The courtroom became a space where grief and determination intersected, where the past was confronted with unflinching honesty. As the proceedings unfolded, the community grappled with the complex legacy of the Oakland County Child Killer case. It was not merely a story of crime and punishment, but a narrative about human resilience, the evolution of forensic science, and the pursuit of truth despite formidable obstacles. In schools and local organizations, discussions emerged about the importance of child safety, early intervention in cases of abuse or neglect, and the role of community vigilance in preventing similar tragedies.
The case also sparked broader conversations about the justice system's capacity to address cold cases. The successful application of genetic genealogy inspired other law enforcement agencies to adopt similar techniques, fueling a renaissance in solving unsolved crimes nationwide. As the trial neared its conclusion, anticipation grew around the impending verdict. The jury was tasked with weighing decades of complex evidence and testimony, balancing scientific data with human stories. For the families, the verdict represented more than a legal outcome. It was a symbol of acknowledgement and possibly a beginning of healing. Throughout the entire journey, from the initial crimes to the breakthroughs decades later, the Oakland County Child Killer case illustrated the intricate interplay of human psychology, technological innovation, and the unyielding desire for justice. Even as the trial reached its climax, the echoes of the past lingered, reminding all involved of the lives forever altered and the community forever changed. The days following the conclusion of the trial were marked by a complex mix of emotions throughout Oakland County. The conviction of the suspect had brought a significant measure of relief and closure to some, yet it also reopened wounds that had lain dormant for decades. Families of the victims, survivors, law enforcement officials, and the community at large found themselves reflecting on the long, difficult road that had led to this moment. The trial had been a profound testament to the perseverance of those involved in the investigation, detectives who had never given up searching for answers, forensic scientists whose advances had finally illuminated cold leads, and families who against all odds had held on to hope. Yet the emotions stirred up were not limited to satisfaction or closure. Grief remained palpable, the loss of the children was irrevocable, and the scars left behind were deep. In the aftermath, many families sought ways to honor the memories of their lost loved ones. Some created foundations or scholarships in the children's names, aiming to foster positive change in the community and support other families dealing with trauma. Memorial services were held, bringing together neighbors, friends and strangers united in mourning and remembrance. These gatherings were quiet, somber but filled with an unmistakable spirit of solidarity. The local schools also took this moment to re-examine safety protocols and community outreach programs. In classrooms where the tragedy had once felt like a distant shadow, efforts were made to incorporate lessons about personal safety, the importance of speaking up, and recognizing warning signs of danger. Counselors and educators worked closely with students to create an environment where children felt heard and protected. Law enforcement agencies across the region used the case as an impetus to review cold cases and update investigative techniques. The success achieved through genetic genealogy and forensic advancements had sparked a renewed commitment to applying science in solving long-standing mysteries. Specialized units were formed, combining experienced detectives with DNA experts and digital analysts. This interdisciplinary approach was designed to uncover the truth in cases where evidence had previously seemed insufficient. The case also influenced the broader legal landscape. Discussions were held about the ethical implications and privacy concerns surrounding the use of genetic databases in criminal investigations. Legislators and legal experts debated how to balance public safety with individual rights, navigating a rapidly evolving technological frontier. Public forums and panels provided spaces for citizens to engage with these topics, reflecting a community deeply invested in both justice and civil liberties. For the families, one of the most challenging aspects was adjusting to life after the trial. The years of uncertainty and anguish had forged bonds among them, but also left many grappling with trauma and loss that would not simply disappear with a verdict. Mental health professionals emphasized the need for ongoing support and healing, recognizing that justice is only one part of the recovery process. Some family members found solace in sharing their stories publicly, raising awareness about the dangers children face and advocating for better resources and protections. Their voices became powerful tools in driving change, transforming personal tragedy into collective action. Others preferred privacy, choosing to remember their loved ones quietly and intimately. The community itself showed resilience, slowly rebuilding its sense of security. Neighborhood watch programs gained renewed energy, and local organizations partnered with law enforcement to provide education and resources aimed at prevention. The tragic history remained a solemn undercurrent, but it also inspired a determination to protect future generations. Meanwhile, questions about the suspect's past and motives continued to draw attention. Psychologists and criminologists studied the case, examining what could be learned about the nature of such crimes and the warning signs that might help prevent them. The suspect's background, once opaque, was scrutinized for patterns and influences, early life experiences, psychological factors, and social environment that could shed light on how such darkness takes root. These studies contributed to a growing field dedicated to understanding and preventing violent crimes against children. Insights from the case informed training programs for educators, law enforcement, and social workers, emphasizing the importance of early intervention and community vigilance. Despite the strides made, some aspects of the case remained shrouded in mystery. The full extent of the suspect's actions, possible accomplices, or other undiscovered victims was never conclusively determined. Investigators acknowledged that while a major chapter had closed, the book on the Oakland County Child Killer might not yet be finished. For many, the legacy of the case was a sober reminder of the fragility of childhood innocence and the profound impact that violence inflicts on families and communities. The memories of those lost continued to ripple through the years, shaping lives and inspiring vigilance. This chapter in Oakland County's history served not only as a story of tragedy and perseverance, but as a call to remember, protect, and act. It underscored the importance of never letting cold cases grow cold for good, and the power of science and community to bring light to even the darkest of shadows. The years that followed the trial brought a new kind of reflection, not only on the individual tragedies, but on the broader societal failures that had allowed the Oakland County Child Killer to remain free for so long. As the community healed in some ways, there was also a growing determination to understand how this nightmare had unfolded unnoticed for so many years, and what lessons could be drawn to prevent anything similar from happening again. Many of those involved in the case, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, family members, and activists, began pushing for reforms in how missing children cases were handled. One major area of focus was the communication and coordination between local police departments, which had historically operated with limited sharing of information. The Oakland County Child Killer case had highlighted how fragmented investigations could inadvertently hinder progress, as clues and evidence collected in one jurisdiction sometimes remained isolated from others. This realization prompted a shift toward integrated databases and more open channels of communication, helping to create a networked approach to missing persons and unsolved crimes. New technology played a vital role, with digital record keeping and the early use of computer systems to cross-reference cases, a far cry from the largely paper-based files of the past. This modernization allowed investigators to identify patterns more quickly, linking cases that might have seemed unrelated. Family members of victims became key voices in advocating for these changes. Their first-hand experiences, marked by frustration, grief, and a desire for answers, lent urgency to calls for systemic reform. Many founded or joined organizations dedicated to missing children and victim advocacy, working to ensure that no family would endure the same long, painful wait for justice. The emotional toll on these families remained profound. The loss of a child is a wound that never fully heals, and the prolonged uncertainty and public attention added layers of complexity. Therapy, support groups, and community events aimed at healing became crucial resources, helping relatives process trauma and find solidarity. Meanwhile, the public's relationship with the case evolved as well. Initially, the fear and suspicion that gripped Oakland County had created a tense atmosphere, but as time passed, a sense of cautious optimism emerged. The conviction offered a measure of closure, even as questions lingered. Still, some residents struggled with feelings of mistrust, both toward law enforcement for the years it took to identify and apprehend the suspect, and toward their neighbors, as the unsettling thought that someone among them had been capable of such violence left a lasting imprint. These fractures within the community underscored the complex social aftermath of such crimes. In schools, conversations about safety deepened. Educators worked to balance the need for vigilance with the importance of not instilling fear in children. Programs aimed at teaching children about personal boundaries, safe strangers, and the importance of speaking up were integrated into curricula, accompanied by increased training for staff to recognize warning signs of abuse or danger. The media continued to revisit the case over the years, producing documentaries, books and articles that recounted the events with varying degrees of detail and perspective. Some sought to sensationalize the tragedy, but many efforts aimed instead to honor the victims and highlight the ongoing importance of vigilance and compassion in communities. One particularly significant development was the way the case brought attention to the evolving field of forensic science. The breakthroughs that had enabled investigators to finally close in on the suspect were part of a larger trend toward using DNA evidence to solve cold cases across the country. The Oakland County case became a touchstone example of how persistence, technological innovation and collaboration could overcome the barriers that once seemed insurmountable. This legacy inspired further investment in forensic research and training. Laboratories expanded their capabilities, and law enforcement agencies established dedicated cold case units staffed with specialists in DNA analysis, criminal profiling, and digital forensics. These teams would go on to solve numerous other cases, building on the foundation laid by the Oakland County investigation. At the same time, the case prompted difficult discussions about the ethical dimensions of using genetic genealogy and other advanced techniques. While these tools proved invaluable, they also raised privacy concerns, sparking debates about how to balance public safety with individual rights. Policymakers, civil rights advocates, and scientists engaged in ongoing dialogue to navigate these complex issues. As the community moved forward, the memories of the children lost continued to inspire efforts toward prevention and protection. Memorials and annual vigils kept their stories alive, reminding all who attended of the preciousness of life and the cost of inaction. The story of the Oakland County Child Killer became a cautionary tale, a testament to human resilience, and a call to vigilance. It underscored how silence, fear, and fragmentation can allow evil to persist, but also how hope, science, and community can eventually prevail. Though the wounds left by the crimes would never fully close, the collective resolve born from tragedy helped shape a safer, more aware society. Families, investigators, and neighbors, each touched by loss and recovery, had contributed to a legacy that would extend far beyond the borders of Oakland County. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw the Oakland County community grappling with a profound duality: on one hand a deep desire to heal from the trauma of the past, and on the other, a cautious watchfulness that the nightmare might somehow return. The arrest and conviction of a suspect had brought some measure of closure, but it could never erase the years of fear and loss. This era became a time for reflection, memorialization, and an intensified focus on prevention. The memory of the children who had vanished or been found was kept alive through numerous community efforts. Local organizations, survivor groups and families came together to create memorials and hold vigils, turning places of sorrow into sites of remembrance and hope. These gatherings were not only about honoring those who were lost, but also about reaffirming a commitment to protecting future generations. Schools in the region introduced new safety protocols, from locked entrances to more comprehensive background checks for volunteers and staff. These measures, while sometimes met with resistance from those who worried about turning schools into fortress-like environments, were embraced by many parents and educators as necessary safeguards. Workshops and educational programs, aimed at teaching children about personal safety, became more prevalent, encouraging open communication between students and trusted adults. One notable aspect of this period was the changing relationship between the community and law enforcement. The earlier decades had been marked by frustration. Families and residents often felt overlooked or dismissed, and communication between different police departments was inconsistent at best. The investigation into the Oakland County Child Killer had exposed many of these shortcomings, and subsequent reforms sought to address them. Police agencies began adopting a more victim-centered approach, recognizing that the family's involvement and trust were essential to any successful investigation. This meant not only providing timely updates, but also offering counseling services and support networks. Investigators received additional training in handling sensitive cases, aiming to balance the need for professionalism with genuine empathy. The technological landscape was rapidly evolving during this time as well. The rise of the internet and digital communication opened new avenues for both crime solving and community awareness. Websites dedicated to missing children and cold cases sprang up, allowing information to be shared quickly and widely. Online forums became spaces where families and advocates could connect, exchange information and organize campaigns. One particular challenge, however, was managing the influx of information and the potential for misinformation. The internet's speed and reach meant that rumors and unverified claims could spread just as quickly as facts. Law enforcement agencies and journalists worked to provide accurate updates while cautioning the public against speculation. The impact of the Oakland County Child Killer case on forensic science continued to resonate throughout the early 21st century. The breakthroughs that had led to identifying the suspect, using DNA evidence preserved from decades-old crime scenes, demonstrated the transformative power of genetics in criminal investigations. This success encouraged the allocation of resources to cold case units nationwide, where forgotten evidence was re-examined with new techniques. Public fascination with the case also influenced popular culture, albeit with a delicate balance. Books, documentaries and podcasts explored the haunting story with a focus on respectful storytelling. The aim was not to sensationalize the tragedy, but to deepen public understanding of the complexities involved, the emotional toll on victims' families, the painstaking nature of investigative work, and the social factors that contributed to the crimes. Despite these efforts, some questions remained unanswered, and ambiguities lingered in the public consciousness. The true identity of the Oakland County Child Killer had been claimed in court, but there were whispers and theories about possible accomplices or overlooked suspects. The sheer span of time over which the crimes occurred meant that some evidence had deteriorated or been lost, making absolute certainty elusive. This uncertainty contributed to a persistent tension within the community. On one level, there was relief that justice had been served. On another, a lingering unease that the full story might never be known. Some families held on to hope that further investigation could one day bring clarity, while others chose to focus on rebuilding their lives beyond the shadow of the past. The psychological impact on survivors and family members was profound and multifaceted. For many, grief was compounded by trauma and a sense of injustice. Counseling and therapy became vital resources, often spanning years or even decades. Mental health professionals worked alongside social workers and community leaders to develop tailored support programs addressing the unique needs of those affected by such a long-lasting ordeal. Children who had grown up in the shadow of the case carried with them memories and fears that influenced their development. Schools and community centers aimed to create safe spaces for these young people, offering programs that fostered resilience and emotional expression. Some became advocates themselves, channeling their experiences into activism and education. In addition to individual healing, there was a collective reckoning with broader social issues. The Oakland County Child Killer case shed light on vulnerabilities in the system, how marginalized communities were disproportionately affected, how poverty and social isolation could create environments where predators operated with relative impunity. Activists and scholars began examining these structural problems, advocating for policy changes and community investments to address root causes. This era also saw advancements in interagency collaboration on a national scale. The lessons learned from Oakland County contributed to the development of networks such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children (NCMECAD), which worked to streamline reporting, improve technology, and coordinate responses to child abductions and exploitation across the country. The lingering shadow of the Oakland County Child Killer was felt not just in Michigan, but across the United States. The case became a somber reminder of the fragility of safety and the vigilance required to protect the most vulnerable. Its story continued to inspire law enforcement agencies to refine their approaches, communities to foster trust, and families to find strength in solidarity. As time moved forward, the narrative of Oakland County transformed from one solely about tragedy to one encompassing resilience, reform, and hope. It became a testament to human endurance, a chapter in American history that, while painful, spurred positive change and a renewed commitment to safeguarding children everywhere. The years following the arrest of a suspect in the Oakland County Child Killer case did not simply mark the end of a dark chapter. They opened a new one filled with complex emotions and lingering questions. Families and investigators alike faced the difficult process of unraveling decades of trauma, searching for peace amid the lingering uncertainties. For the families, closure was not an immediate relief but rather a slow and uneven journey. The announcement of the arrest brought a mixture of emotions: relief that justice might be served, sorrow for the irretrievable losses, and frustration at the many years that had passed without answers. Some found solace in knowing that the person who had haunted their memories was finally in custody. Others wrestled with feelings of anger and disbelief, questioning whether the full truth had truly been uncovered. Therapeutic communities formed, both formal and informal, where families could share their experiences without fear of judgment. These groups became a vital source of support, allowing individuals to speak openly about grief, guilt, and trauma that had been buried for years. The collective experience of loss created bonds that helped many navigate their personal healing journeys. Investigators who had worked on the case for decades also faced their own struggles. For some, the years of painstaking effort finally bore fruit in the arrest and conviction. For others, there remained a nagging sense of what might have been missed. The passage of time had taken its toll on physical evidence, memories, and witness reliability. Even with advances in forensic science, questions persisted about whether all aspects of the case had been fully addressed. The challenge of piecing together events that had occurred over decades meant that many details remained shrouded in mystery. Some witnesses were no longer available, and others were reluctant to revisit painful memories. The complexity of the case highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining communication channels, lessons that would shape future investigations nationwide. Public interest in the case did not fade with the arrest. Documentaries, news features, and podcasts revisited the story, presenting it to new audiences and encouraging broader discussions about child safety, law enforcement, and the justice system. However, the tone remained respectful and measured, focused on honoring the victims and acknowledging the challenges faced by those involved. These renewed discussions also sparked critical examination of law enforcement practices from the 1970s and 1980s. The case underscored the fragmentation that had hampered earlier investigations, where multiple jurisdictions operated with limited cooperation. The struggle to unify efforts highlighted systemic issues that many agencies have since worked to overcome, emphasizing collaboration and information sharing as crucial tools in solving complex crimes. The ripple effects of the Oakland County Child Killer case extended beyond Michigan, influencing national policies on missing children and cold case management. Agencies across the country began to prioritize the use of DNA and other forensic tools in revisiting unsolved cases. Cold case units received increased funding and attention, recognizing the potential to bring justice even decades after a crime. One significant outcome was the development of more sophisticated databases for DNA and fingerprints, enabling law enforcement to link crimes and suspects across state lines. This technology revolutionized how cases were approached, transforming what was once thought to be lost evidence into pivotal leads. The success in Oakland County became a benchmark, inspiring hope in other communities grappling with unsolved crimes.
At the community level, schools and organizations redoubled efforts to protect children. Programs teaching children about personal safety, stranger danger, and how to seek help became staples in educational curricula. Parents and caregivers were encouraged to maintain open dialogue with children about boundaries and trust, emphasizing empowerment rather than fear. In addition to practical measures, the case prompted deeper reflection on societal factors contributing to vulnerability. Discussions emerged around issues such as socioeconomic disparities, family dynamics, and mental health, recognizing that prevention required more than just physical safety measures. Community support networks and social services sought to identify at-risk children and families, offering resources before tragedy could strike. The enduring impact of the Oakland County Child Killer case also shaped the way survivors and victims' families were viewed and treated. Advocates worked tirelessly to change perceptions, pushing for recognition that these individuals were not simply passive victims, but resilient people deserving dignity and agency. This shift influenced legislation aimed at improving victim services and legal protections. Despite the progress made, the psychological scars left by the case were profound and ongoing. Many families lived with unanswered questions and the haunting knowledge that their lives had been irrevocably altered. Mental health professionals noted the importance of long-term support, as grief and trauma could resurface unexpectedly, especially during anniversaries or related news events. The story of the Oakland County Child Killer remains a powerful reminder of both the fragility and strength of the human spirit. It reveals the deep wounds inflicted by such crimes and the remarkable capacity for communities to come together in response. It also illustrates the evolving nature of justice, how time, technology, and perseverance can eventually illuminate the darkest corners. As the case continues to be studied and remembered, it stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The children who were lost have not been forgotten, and their stories continue to inspire efforts to protect the innocent and hold perpetrators accountable. In the years that followed the breakthrough in the Oakland County Child Killer case, the justice system faced a complex landscape. While the arrest of a suspect provided a beacon of hope, it also brought to light the intricate challenges of securing a conviction based on decades-old evidence and testimonies. The path from arrest to trial was long marked by meticulous preparation and an acute awareness of the emotional weight carried by everyone involved. The suspect, whose identity remained confidential during ongoing investigations and pre-trial proceedings, was known to have lived in the region during the time of the crimes. His background became a subject of intense scrutiny as investigators and prosecutors sought to understand not just the physical evidence, but the psychological profile that might explain the terrifying spree of abductions and murders. Forensic experts played a critical role in bridging the gap between the past and present. DNA analysis, once a nascent technology in the 1980s, had become far more advanced, offering tools that could link the suspect to crime scenes with a level of certainty previously unattainable. Yet, despite this technological progress, challenges persisted. Degraded samples, chain of custody questions, and the sheer passage of time demanded that every piece of evidence be evaluated with utmost care. Witness testimony was another essential element of the prosecution's case. Many witnesses were now decades older, their memories dimmed or clouded by the passage of time. Some had passed away, others had moved on, and a few remained reluctant to revisit the pain of those dark years. Prosecutors understood the delicate balance between honoring these voices and ensuring the reliability of their statements. The families of the victims found themselves navigating a complicated emotional terrain. While the arrest rekindled hopes for justice, it also reopened old wounds. The public attention surrounding the case placed a renewed spotlight on their personal tragedies, making privacy and healing difficult to maintain. Yet, many expressed a determination to see the process through, motivated by a desire to ensure their children's stories were told fully and truthfully. Legal proceedings were slow and deliberate. Defense attorneys raised questions about the integrity of the evidence, the potential for contamination, and the fairness of trying a case so many years after the crimes. The courts grappled with these issues, mindful of the need to uphold justice while safeguarding the rights of the accused. The trial itself became a focal point for the community and beyond. It was not merely a legal battle, but a collective reckoning with a painful chapter in history. Media coverage was carefully managed to avoid sensationalism, aiming instead to provide a respectful and thorough account of the facts as they unfolded. Documentaries and news outlets revisited the case with renewed interest, further educating the public about the long and difficult journey toward accountability. Psychologists and criminal profilers offered insight into the mind of the suspect, attempting to understand the factors that could drive someone to such horrific acts. Their analyses highlighted the complexity of human behavior and the importance of early intervention in potential offenders. This aspect of the trial fostered broader discussions about mental health, community safety, and preventive measures. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies took stock of the lessons learned throughout the investigation. The fragmentation of efforts during the initial crimes had been a significant obstacle, underscoring the necessity for interagency cooperation. In the wake of the arrest, police departments and prosecutors' offices worked to develop protocols and systems that would prevent such disjointed investigations in the future.
The impact of the case extended into legislative action. Advocates pushed for stronger laws related to child abduction, forensic evidence preservation, and victim support services. Some of these initiatives were informed directly by the experiences of the families and investigators involved in Oakland County. These changes aimed not only to punish perpetrators, but to create environments where children could be better protected. Community organizations also emerged from the shadow of the case, dedicated to education and prevention. Programs focusing on child safety, neighborhood watch initiatives, and parental support networks gained momentum. The memory of the victims fueled a commitment to build safer spaces for the next generation. Despite these efforts, the emotional scars endured. For many, the pain of loss was a lifelong companion, and the arrival of justice brought only partial solace. The case became a stark reminder that some wounds cannot be fully healed but can be honored through remembrance and continued vigilance. As the trial progressed, unexpected revelations occasionally surfaced, shedding new light on aspects of the case previously misunderstood or overlooked. These moments underscored the complexity of the investigation and the evolving nature of truth in such prolonged and intricate criminal matters. The suspect's own narrative, whether expressed through courtroom statements or legal filings, added another layer to the story. Attempts to understand his motivations and actions were met with a mixture of skepticism and clinical analysis. The courtroom became a space where multiple perspectives, legal, psychological, and personal, converged in the search for justice. Throughout this time, the families maintained a fragile hope that the trial would affirm their loss and provide some measure of closure. Their resilience, coupled with the dedication of those pursuing justice, stood as a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of profound tragedy. The courtroom was a place heavy with tension and memory. The trial of the Oakland County Child Killer suspect had drawn attention not only from local communities, but from those across the country who had followed the case for decades. The hearing room itself, with its muted colors and somber decor, held a silent weight. The echoes of voices past, the absence of young lives, and the hope for answers after so many years. During the proceedings, the prosecution laid out its case with care, methodically presenting evidence collected from the original investigations alongside modern forensic findings. DNA testing played a pivotal role. Experts testified about how minute traces preserved from crime scenes matched the suspect's genetic profile. These links were the product of painstaking work, combining historical records with cutting-edge science. It was a reminder of how much technology had transformed the pursuit of justice since the 1980s. Witnesses took the stand, some recalling memories from a lifetime ago. Their testimonies were often tinged with sorrow and frustration, voices breaking as they described the missing children and the fear that gripped Oakland County during those dark years. Parents recounted the days when hope flickered faintly, only to be extinguished by grim discoveries. Community members spoke of the palpable sense of vulnerability that had settled over neighborhoods once bustling with carefree youth. Defense attorneys challenged some of the evidence, emphasizing the challenges posed by time, faded memories, lost or degraded samples, and the absence of direct eyewitness accounts linking the suspect to specific acts. They painted a picture of uncertainty, urging the jury to consider whether the weight of decades could cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Their argument was rooted in the fundamental principle that justice must be certain, even when decades have passed. Throughout the trial, experts in criminal psychology were called upon to shed light on the behavioral patterns of offenders like the Oakland County Child Killer. They spoke about the disturbing but often predictable escalation in such predators' crimes, detailing how early warning signs might have been missed. Their insights delved into the complex interplay of nature and nurture, exploring what could drive a person to commit such horrific acts, and how communities might better protect their most vulnerable members. Outside the courthouse, the families of victims and community supporters gathered quietly, their presence a reminder of the human stories behind the headlines. Some wore pins or shirts bearing the faces of lost children, others held hands in silent solidarity. For them, the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, a long-awaited moment to honor their children's memories and confront the shadows that had haunted them for so long. The media coverage was cautious yet persistent. Reporters and documentarians revisited the timeline of disappearances and murders, providing context for those unfamiliar with the case's depth. They refrained from sensationalism, instead focusing on the painstaking work of investigators and the resilience of the families. This approach helped maintain a respectful tone, allowing the community space to process its collective grief, while acknowledging the progress made. As the days passed, new details occasionally emerged, small revelations that added texture to the narrative. These included previously undisclosed communications between investigators, insights into the suspect's background and movements during the 1970s and 1980s, and reflections from retired officers who had long felt the weight of unsolved cases. Each piece was a fragment of a larger puzzle, slowly coming together after years of silence. One of the most poignant moments in the trial came when a surviving victim testified. Though many of the crimes resulted in tragedy, a few children had escaped forever changed but alive. Their voices offered a rare glimpse into the terror and trauma experienced, as well as the resilience that allowed them to endure. Their courage in speaking publicly was met with deep respect, underscoring the ongoing impact of the crimes beyond the immediate loss. Legal debates extended to the handling of evidence, with discussions about the standards for forensic science in past decades versus today. This highlighted the evolution of criminal investigation techniques and the importance of preserving evidence properly. It also sparked conversations about how justice systems nationwide could improve processes to avoid similar challenges in cold cases. Behind the scenes, investigators worked closely with prosecutors to prepare for closing arguments, carefully weaving together the narrative that would be presented to the jury. They knew the stakes were high, not only for the suspect and families, but for the broader community yearning for closure. The trial was a powerful example of perseverance in the face of complexity and time. Throughout the courtroom, the presence of the victims' families was a testament to their unwavering commitment. They had waited decades for this moment, enduring uncertainty and pain. Their dignity and strength provided a foundation for the proceedings, reminding all present that at the heart of this case were children whose lives deserved to be remembered with care and justice. As the trial neared its conclusion, reflections on the case's wider implications became more frequent. Experts, advocates, and community members discussed how the experience of Oakland County had shaped approaches to child safety, law enforcement collaboration, and forensic innovation. The case had become a catalyst for change, a somber lesson etched into the fabric of criminal justice history. The courtroom atmosphere was charged yet respectful, a place where grief, hope, and the quest for truth intersected. Jurors listened intently to testimony and arguments, tasked with a heavy responsibility to weigh decades of evidence and make a decision that could not only bring justice, but also help heal a fractured community. Despite the gravity of the trial, moments of humanity surfaced, quiet exchanges between family members, a consoling gesture from an attorney, a witness pausing to compose themselves. These glimpses of compassion reminded everyone present of the profound emotional dimensions underpinning the legal process. As closing arguments approached, attorneys on both sides prepared to encapsulate their narratives, hoping to persuade the jury to see the case through their lens. The prosecution sought to demonstrate a clear and compelling link between the suspect and the crimes, while the defense emphasized caution and the importance of reasonable doubt. For many, the trial was more than a search for a verdict. It was a journey toward understanding, remembrance, and the possibility of healing wounds that had festered for far too long. The collective attention and care given to this case reflected a society grappling with its darkest chapters and striving to emerge with renewed commitment to protect its children. The final days of the trial carried a weight unlike any before it. For the families of the lost children, for the community that had held its breath for decades, and for the justice system tasked with unraveling a knot that had only tightened with time, this was a moment of reckoning. The courtroom, once a place of sterile procedure, had become a vessel for stories long left untold, emotions long suppressed, and a collective yearning for truth. As the jury retreated to deliberate, the atmosphere remained heavy with anticipation and reflection. Each person present was acutely aware that what transpired in those moments would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The verdict was not simply about one individual, it was about a community's journey through darkness and the fragile hope of closure. In the days leading up to the verdict, the community held its breath, revisiting memories both painful and tender. The parents of the missing children, who had aged visibly over the years, found solace in shared stories and the presence of others who understood their grief intimately. Their pain, though softened by time, was no less profound. They had carried the unbearable weight of uncertainty, wondering endlessly what had happened to their children, and now, finally, they were at the threshold of answers. The media coverage remained measured, capturing the dignity and resilience of the families without descending into sensationalism. Reporters recounted the painstaking investigative efforts, the advances in forensic science that had breathed new life into cold cases, and the persistence of law enforcement officers who refused to give up. The retelling served as a reminder that justice often moves slowly, but when it arrives, can carry a powerful message of hope and accountability. When the jury returned, the silence that fell over the courtroom was nearly palpable. The foreperson stood and read the verdict, their voice steady but somber. The suspect was found guilty on multiple counts related to the abduction and murder of several children over the course of the investigation. The decision brought a complex mixture of relief, sorrow and reflection. For the families, the verdict was a bittersweet moment. Relief that justice had been served mingled with the enduring ache of loss. Their children would never return, but the acknowledgement of their suffering and the truth unveiled brought a measure of peace. In whispered conversations and quiet tears, they honored the memories of the young lives stolen so many years ago. The community's response was equally nuanced. While there was a collective sigh of relief, there was also an awareness that the scars left by the Oakland County Child Killer would never fully fade. The case had shaped a generation's understanding of safety, trust and the vulnerabilities of youth. Schools, neighborhoods and families would forever carry the lessons learned from those harrowing years. In the wake of the verdict, conversations began about the broader implications of the case. Law enforcement agencies examined the challenges faced in the original investigations, recognizing the critical importance of early intervention, collaboration, and the preservation of evidence. The advances in DNA technology that had ultimately identified the perpetrator served as a beacon for other cold cases, inspiring renewed hope that time need not be a barrier to justice. Advocates for missing and exploited children highlighted the importance of community vigilance and support systems, emphasizing how critical it was to maintain awareness and resources for prevention and intervention. The story of Oakland County became a cautionary tale, but also a testament to resilience, the power of persistence and the enduring human desire for truth and healing. For the justice system, the trial underscored the complexities of prosecuting decades-old crimes. It highlighted the delicate balance between the pursuit of justice and the challenges posed by the passage of time. The case became a catalyst for discussions on how to improve investigative practices, ensuring that even the oldest cases can be approached with renewed rigor and sensitivity. As the courtroom emptied, the echoes of the trial lingered in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it. The verdict was not an end but a new beginning, an invitation to remember, to learn and to strive toward a safer, more compassionate future. In the quiet moments after the proceedings, families gathered privately to reflect on the journey. Some spoke of the relief found in knowing the truth, others of the bittersweet recognition that justice, while necessary, could never fully heal the wounds. Together they honored their children's memories, promising to keep their stories alive. The Oakland County Child Killer case remains a somber chapter in American history, a reminder of the fragility of innocence and the enduring strength of community. It is a story of loss and grief, but also of hope and determination. Though the darkness once seemed impenetrable, the light of truth and justice has finally begun to shine through. For those who listen and remember, the case stands as a testament to the importance of never giving up, of holding fast to the belief that one day, even the coldest mysteries may yield their secrets, and that in seeking justice, we honor the lives forever changed.